Engine building is an art. And by art, I mean it's not art at all. It's a lot of math and measurements and following direction. If you can build a Lego set, you can build an engine. Everything has a specific order of assembly, everything has a specific acceptable measurement, and while you can deviate from those requirements, it's usually best to only do that if you really know what you're doing. Or if you're pretty sure you know what you're doing and you're also feeling kind of lazy. Today we're going to assemble a motorcycle engine, a Suzuki Hayabusa engine that I am building to handle over 700 turbocharged horsepower. So grab your Haynes manual, calibrate your micrometers, and join me as we assemble the most expensive Lego set. This engine was stock, but when we're done, there won't be many Suzuki parts left. We're adding a lot of new upgraded stuff. I'll go through the things as I put them in, but if you want the full list, here it is. The first part of this adventure is to disassemble the old engine. To do this, you can read the disassembly part of the manual, or you can just do what I did and kind of remove every fastener that you see. If you've never done this before, you should probably read the manual because there are some important parts. Like when you remove the camshaft covers, you need to do it in a certain pattern and steps, otherwise the hold down casting could break in half. But honestly, disassembly is mostly just removing parts. So start taking stuff apart and sort it out on your workbench so you know where everything is, and do not let your cats wander around on the table or you will find your clutch springs under your couch 3 weeks later. Clean up your parts with some soap and water. You can get these steam cleaned if you want to look snazzy, but I don't. It's also important to clean up all the gasket surfaces. You can use a plastic scraper and a rag with some acetone or alcohol. Set out all your new parts and all the old parts you're reusing on your workbench. Take all the parts you won't need again and haphazardly throw them into a tub somewhere. Probably where you can get to it later when you need to check something or find a part that you actually do need. The first step for my engine build was to assemble the transmission. This is not part of the engine assembly unless you have a motorcycle engine, which I do. I got different ratios for some of the gears and had them undercut so they would be less likely to slip out. This is a pretty straightforward step. You just assemble everything in the order shown in the manual. There is an important thing to note here. The bushings for the gears have holes in them. They need to be lined up with the holes drilled in the shaft so the oil can go through and lubricate the gears. While doing this on the output shaft, I couldn't remember if I had done it on the input shaft, so I had to totally disassemble that one to double check. It was fine. Once it's all together, install it in the bottom case half and do a quick run through the gears to make sure everything works. About this time, you'll remember that the gears need to be installed in the top case half for assembly, so go ahead and fix that. Once you have your crankshaft, your connecting rods, and your pistons, you will need to get them all balanced together. Fortunately for me, I don't have to do this. An inline 4-cylinder engine is symmetrical. When the two inner cylinders are at the very top, the two outer cylinders are at the very bottom. Most opposed cylinder engines are the same way, and also inline 6 engines. Basically, the extra weight of one connecting rod is offset by the weight of the opposed connecting rod, and so if all of your pistons are the same weight, and all of your rods are the same weight, and your crankshaft is balanced to itself, then you're good to go. Often you will need to get crankshaft bearings that are a specific size for your engine. The crankshaft and connecting rod bearings rely on a thin pillow of pressurized oil to provide the bearing surface. For this to work, there needs to be a very specific gap between the spinning crankshaft and the stationary bearing. That gap for the Hayabusa is about 17 10,000ths of an inch, plus or minus 5 10,000ths. Basically, a sheet of paper is 5 times thicker than the allowable variation in that gap. Because manufacturing is not perfect, some engine cases and crankshafts come out of the factory with bearing journals that are a tiny bit larger or a tiny bit smaller than they're supposed to be. Instead of throwing away all of the engine cases and crankshafts that aren't exactly perfect, they make bearings that are slightly bigger or smaller. The Hayabusa has letters stamped on the case and the crankshaft, and you just look up the table to find the correct corresponding bearing. But if you buy an aftermarket crankshaft, you need to measure it yourself, using a micrometer. Micrometers are great. You feel like an actual engine builder using one. They look like something that you need to have to build an engine, and you do. They also take some understanding to be able to read. It's almost like an ancient language. You can buy digital micrometers, but they look way less cool, and you will look like a total dork using them. The first step in using a micrometer is to remember how to read a micrometer. You will figure it out eventually, but not before wishing you had just bought the digital one. Once you get that measurement, you can look it up in your shop manual or the screenshot you got from someone else's shop manual on YouTube. That'll give you the correct bearings that you need. Same goes for the connecting rod. You might also need new thrust bearings. These are the bearings that keep the crankshaft from moving side to side. You want a little play in the crankshaft side to side, something like 0.04 of an inch, depending on your engine. And if you have too much, you'll need to buy the appropriate thickness thrust bearings. You can use Plastigauge to measure bearing clearance. This is a product you stick between your bearing and your crankshaft, and then you torque the bolts down. This is not as good as measuring with a micrometer, but it is cheaper, and if you're trying to reuse bearings and you don't know exactly how thick they are, you can find your clearance this way. If you're using new bearings, you will need to order them, but before you do that, you'll need to remember something that I get irrationally angry at. Babbitt bearings are often sold by the half. There's a top half and a bottom half, and never in the history of engine building has anyone needed to buy just one half of a crankshaft bearing. In fact, the manual says that you must replace both of them. There is no good reason that these should not be sold in pairs. To make this even more confusing, Suzuki sells the main bearings by the half, but the connecting rod bearings in pairs. But even though Suzuki sells 2 bearing halves in each box with one part number, if you order that part number from Partzilla, they will only send you half a bearing. Some places sell them by the pair, so it's not clear what you need to order. I had to order more, and my build got further delayed. All of this is to say that if you work at an auto company and you know the guy whose idea it is to sell Babbitt bearings by the half instead of the pair, do me a favor and poison his coffee. Anyway, once you get your bearings, install them in the case and then smear some assembly lube on them. You'll need to use assembly lube on all your bearing surfaces. This is a thick, oily paste that keeps all your surfaces lubricated and happy when you start the engine for the first time. With the bearings nicely nestled into the top case half, it's time to install the connecting rods. You can do this with a crankshaft outside of the case, but the case holds the crank, so this makes it a little bit easier. Install the bearings you ordered and then reordered because bearings are sold in the stupidest possible way, and then assemble the connecting rod onto the crankshaft. And then disassemble them because you forgot to apply assembly lube to the bearing surfaces. The manual for this engine says to make sure the ID code on the connecting rod is facing the intake side of the engine. I am using aftermarket Carrillo rods. I'm not sure why the ID code orientation is necessary since the rods look symmetric. But since the new rods have ID codes on one side, I installed them in the prescribed way. The bolts need lubrication on them before you can put on the nut and torque it down. Suzuki says to use moly paste, but the Carrillo rods come with a thread lube. This helps to lower friction on the threads to get the correct stretch on the bolt when you torque it down. Remember to put the lube under the head of the bolt and not just the threads. The Suzuki manual says to torque the bolts down in 2 stages, but Carrillo has 2 options. One is to measure bolt stretch, and this is usually the technically correct way to do things. You measure the bolt before it's torqued, and again after, and you aim for a specific length. For me, it was about 0.07 of an inch. The other thing you can do is torque it to a specific initial spec and then add an exact amount of angle. There are torque wrenches that make it easy to do this by measuring angle and torque, but I don't have one. So I just eyeballed it and then measured the length and then went back and forth until all the bolts were in spec for both maximum torque and stretch. If you took anything out of the case during disassembly, like the oil sprayers or some other part of the transmission, now would be a good time to install those parts, because the next step is to assemble the case. Remember earlier when I told you to clean up the sealing surfaces and you didn't do that? Well, now you have to do it. Wipe everything down to at least good enough status. You'll need to add some RTV in specific locations. The manual says to use Suzuki Bond, but you can also use Yama Bond, Honda Bond, or probably anything with Bond in the name.
James Bond.
There are some oil passages in here, so be sure not to add RTV where it's not supposed to be. Then you just drop the bottom case on while lining up the shift forks to the transmission and bolt everything down. Next, we have to get the pistons ready, but before that, we have to get the piston rings ready. The piston rings need a specific gap, and they usually ship with a smaller gap than you need. If your engine is stock, just do what the manual says, but if you're making more power with higher compression or turbocharger or nitrous, you'll want to add more gap. Suzuki says the gap should be between 0.08 millimeters and 0.2 millimeters. I'm using JE pistons, and they give this nice chart as a guideline. I'm building a blown race engine, so we'll need the largest gap. The bore is 81 millimeters, converted to inches and multiplying by 0.006 inches, and then converting back to metric, we get a ring gap of 7.4 meters. Wait, no. If we convert 0.006 inches to metric and then multiply that by 81 millimeters and then convert that back to inches, we get a ring gap of 42 millionths of an inch. So after Googling around and just seeing what everyone else is doing, we're going to go with a ring gap of 17 thousandths on the top and 19 thousandths on the bottom. To adjust this, you stick the ring in the bore and measure, and then you file the edges, install, measure, and repeat. There are machines to do this, but you can just use a file as long as you're careful to keep the edges square. Piston rings go on in a certain way. Your manual will tell you which way, but it's usually the same. The gap in the rings is clocked apart 120 degrees, with the top ring and the wavy oil ring at the bottom, the middle ring and lower oil ring at the top left, and the upper oil ring at the top right. If there are letters or numbers on your rings, they usually face up. If you're installing the old pistons back in, you'll want to put them back in the same cylinder that they came out of. So now is a good time to travel back in time and mark all the pistons so you know where they go. There will usually be some indication for which direction the pistons go in the engine. For the Hayabusa, there's a dimple on the exhaust side. It's important to get this right, otherwise your pistons will slam into your intake valves, bending your valves and ruining your piston and costing you a lot of time and money. Unfortunately for me, these aftermarket pistons I bought seem to give no indication on the top of which side is intake and which side is exhaust. So I will be guessing. Probably this way? It's probably this way. After reading the instructions, which I probably should have started with, I realized the JE logo on the bottom of the piston is always on the exhaust side, so that's nice. I am running oversized exhaust valves. They are 1 millimeter larger in diameter. These pistons are not made for oversized exhaust valves, but I did measure them and they look like they have plenty of clearance. The correct thing to do would be to put some putty in the engine on the top of the pistons, assemble everything, crank it over, and measure how thick the putty is to make sure I have proper clearance between the piston and the valve. I'm not going to do this. I can get away with this for 2 reasons. 1, I'm feeling lucky. I'm usually pretty lucky. Is this a good approach? Absolutely not, but I'm going to do it anyway. The other reason is that this is a low compression engine. I will be adding a spacer plate between the block and the cylinders. Part of this is because I'm using a stroker crank, but it also moves the pistons away from the valves and lowers the compression ratio. This means my clearance should already be more than I need. I did measure the piston diameter, and it is what it's supposed to be, so that's nice. I also measured the bore of the cylinders, and to do that, I used this device, which is the worst device in a machine shop. You stick it in there, and you try to get it perfectly horizontal at the exact center of the bore. You tighten the end to lock it in place, and you measure it with micrometers. If you do this 5 times, you will get at least 6 different measurements. They do make this tool, which I do not own, but I know someone who does, which is even better. So I measured my bore in several places to make sure it was within spec. I also visually checked to make sure the coating on the cylinder walls was still good, which you can tell by just making sure the crisscross hone pattern is still there. Suzuki says the maximum clearance from the piston to the cylinder should be about 1/1000th of an inch, and mine is 4.5 times that, which seems odd. The cylinders are larger than the standard spec, but only by a little bit. However, if we look at the instructions that came with the pistons, which again we should have done earlier, we see that the JE pistons are designed to have a much larger clearance than stock. And with the fact that I'm running a turbo, it's all right where it should be. Probably there will be audible piston noise until the engine gets up to temperature. Hopefully that's not a problem. I guess we'll find out. Pistons are installed onto the connecting rods by sliding the pin through and locking it in with the ring clips. Be sure to put plenty of assembly lube on the wrist pin before installing it. The next step is to install that spacer plate and then the cylinders onto the studs over the pistons. Or it would be if I hadn't forgotten one important thing. The cylinders are located using 2 dowel pins that are just the right length, so long as you don't have a spacer plate between the crankcase and the cylinders. I do, so I had to go lathe out new dowel pins that were longer. With that done, it was time to slide the cylinders onto the pistons. They have tools to make this easier, but it's pretty easy with another set of hands. So you'll need to get the assistance of 4-time Pikes Peak Hill Climb champion racing driver Robin Shute, or really anybody else. The cylinders have tapers at the bottom, so you just kind of gently squeeze the rings in as you slide down the cylinder. Once you get the cylinders on there, you will realize the studs in the side of the engine are too short because of that spacer you added. So you'll need to slide the cylinders up a bit and crank those out to be replaced with longer bolts. The next step is to assemble the head. You'll want to mill the surface flat and then recut the valve seats for new valves, add heavier springs, new guides, seals, keepers, retainers, shim the springs to get the right spring pressure. I did none of this. I paid someone else to do all of it. So if you're doing this part, you'll want to find a different video, or just pay somebody else to do it. You'll want to install the dowels and a fresh new head gasket, and then slide the cylinder head down over the studs. The Hayabusa comes with bolts for the cylinders, but I swapped them to some high-strength studs. This does make it a little more difficult to get the head on because of the chain guide, but it's not too hard. Before you put on the nuts, you'll want to lubricate them and the washers with some oil so you can get the right clamping force when you torque them down to spec. Torquing these down is usually a multi-step process. Check the manual, it's kind of important. On top of all the valves go these shims, and on top of all those shims go buckets, and on top of those buckets go camshafts. These shims are probably not the correct size, but the only way to find out the correct size is to put it all together and measure. But that comes later. First we need to set our camshaft timing. You won't need to do this most of the time because most engines don't have adjustable camshafts, but I bought adjustable camshaft sprockets, so we gotta do this. On a non-turbo engine, you usually want your intake valve to start opening before your exhaust valve is closed, so you get more fresh intake charge in the cylinder. But with a turbo engine like mine, that usually just means you're pushing fresh air and fuel into the exhaust, causing your exhaust gas temperatures to get really high. So we're going to reduce that overlap. Setting camshaft timing could be a whole video on its own, and I will link a video in the description that goes over it in detail. But the basic gist of it is that you use a degree wheel with a pointer to set your piston at top dead center. Then you rotate the engine until you get maximum lift on the intake valve and look at the degree wheel to see where that's at. That's your intake camshaft timing. Loosen the adjustable cam sprocket bolts and rotate the camshaft slightly and then do it again and again until it's right. Same for the exhaust. It's pretty easy, but it does take time, some focus, and some math. Okay, so you remember those shims we put in that were not the right size? Now is the time to fix that. Pick a cylinder, rotate the engine so the camshaft is not pressing down on the intake valve for that cylinder. Get out one of these feeler gauge tools and start sticking feelers in there until one doesn't fit. Your gap is the largest size that will fit. Your manual will specify a range of acceptable gaps. If your gap is outside that range, you have to do some math. If the gap is too small, you will need a thinner shim to make that gap bigger. If the people who built your cylinder head did a good job, all of the shims will be about the same size, and mine were. They were all about 2.65 millimeters. While you have that feeler gauge out, you might want to gap your spark plugs. Turbo engines usually need a smaller gap, or just use whatever comes out of the box. It's probably fine. After that, you put on all of the stuff we haven't talked about: oil pan, clutch cover, whatever. I hope you're reading the manual for your engine and not just doing what I say, because if you are, I am sorry about all of the problems that you're about to have. The next step is to install the engine in the car, which will require poorly welded mounts with CNC spacers. By the way, Sencut Sen told me they are ramping up machining, and so they dropped prices and sent me a 20% off CNC discount code. So if you haven't had anything CNC'd from them yet, now is a great time. We do still need to start the engine to make sure it works, but we're not even close to that yet, so hit that subscribe button so you can come back and see if my lackadaisical attitude towards engine building is an acceptable approach. The final step of the engine building process is to make a whole YouTube video about building your engine. That way you can upload it and commenters can remind you about all of the things that you did wrong. Most of those comments will not be very helpful because, let's be honest, most of your audience is not as smart as they think they are. But then again, you are not as smart as you think you are, so maybe don't be so cocky.